It was 1992, a cold night in the middle of the Pacific, when I came face to face with something I will never forget. I have been a fisherman since I was 17, the son of sailors and grandson of a captain who mysteriously disappeared off the coast of Baja California. The sea has been my home, but that night, it became my worst enemy. For years, I had heard rumors on the docks. They talked about a ship that appears in the fog, a boat that does not belong to this world. No one who has seen it is ever the same. I used to make fun of those stories. Now, I wish I hadn't done it. It all started with an offer I couldn't refuse. An old acquaintance, Ramiro, hired me for a night job. I was going to do a quick job, go out to the open sea, collect nets, return before dawn. The pay was good, and I needed the money. We left in his small boat, the Storm. Ramiro, always superstitious, dropped a little liquor into the sea as an offering before setting sail. I laughed at his gesture, although something in his gaze seemed different to me that night. A mixture of fear and resignation. We had barely sailed a couple of hours when the fog began to surround us. It was cold, as if we were being enveloped by a living creature. The lights of the ship seemed to be devoured by that mist. And although Ramiro tried to joke to calm the nerves, I could feel the tension in the air. The radio stopped working, a detail that bothered me more than I wanted to admit. The sound of the water hitting the hull seemed distant, as if we had entered a place where time and space did not behave as they should. Then I saw it. At first, it was a shadow in the fog, a tall and thin silhouette that swayed with the waves. I thought it was an illusion, something caused by the lack of sleep or the humidity in my eyes. But as we got closer, I realized it was real. An old wooden boat with torn sails and ropes hanging as if they were viscera. It was a floating specter, something that shouldn't be there. Ramiro saw it too. He didn't say anything, but his face decomposed. I will never forget the expression of terror in his eyes. "Ramiro," I said, finally breaking the silence. But before he could react, we heard a strange sound, like a groan that came from everywhere and from nowhere. It was weak but full of pain. It was not human, and at the same time it seemed to be. Ramiro, pale as a dead man, began to pray in a low voice. It was then that the figures appeared. First one, then two, until the entire ship was full. They were men, or at least what was left of them. Their bodies were bony, their clothes gray and wet, but the worst were their faces. They had no eyes. Instead of empty sockets, there was torn flesh, as if they had been torn off with their hands. Those beings moved slowly, as if they were trapped in an eternal dream. They seemed to scream, but from their mouths, no sound came out. I felt a chill run down my spine. Ramiro was paralyzed. I tried to take control of the helm, but no matter how much I turned, the ship did not move. It was as if something was holding us, keeping us anchored in that cursed place. The figures began to look at us, or at least that's what it seemed. Although they had no eyes, their attention was fixed on us. One of them, taller than the rest, raised a bony hand and pointed directly at me. It was in that moment when I heard the voice. It was a barely audible whisper, but it echoed in my mind like thunder. "Why do you see us? You shouldn't see us." I closed my eyes, but the images were still there, as if they were printed on my eyelids. I tried to scream, but my voice was trapped in my throat. I felt the cold invade me, not only my body but also my soul. It was as if they were absorbing something from me, something that I could never recover. Suddenly, the ship began to shake violently. Ramiro, still in a trance, was thrown to the ground. I looked toward the ghost ship and saw that it was fading away. The figures began to retreat, sinking into the fog. But before disappearing completely, one of them jumped into the water. I didn't see it clearly, but I heard the splash. And then, a sound that I will never forget. Heavy breathing, as if something huge was swimming beneath us. I tried to start the engine, but it didn't respond. Ramiro, still on the ground, murmured words that I didn't understand. The silence returned, but it was a silence that weighed. It wasn't natural. I felt that something was watching us from the depths. Then it happened. The ship tilted to one side, as if something had crashed into it from below. It was an immense force, and I knew it was not a normal animal. I held on to the mast while Ramiro screamed, pointing toward the water. Something emerged. I cannot describe it completely because my mind refuses to remember it clearly. It was big, dark, and had a shape that did not belong to this world. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were like wells of darkness. And when they looked at me, I felt that time stopped. With a violent blow, the creature disappeared, leaving a wake that made the boat rock. The engine finally responded, and Ramiro, with a last effort, managed to start it. We moved away from that place as quickly as we could. We did not speak for the rest of the trip. When we finally reached the coast, Ramiro simply looked at me and said, "Never speak of this again," and I didn't, not until now. Since that night, my life has never been the same. I have recurring nightmares in which I am again on that boat, trapped in the fog, with those figures watching me. Sometimes, when I am alone in the water, I feel like someone is watching me from the depths. I know I am not alone. Something stayed with me that night, something I cannot explain. The sea, my home for so many years, is now a place that fills me with terror. And even though I try, I can't stop hearing that whisper. Why do you see us? You shouldn't see us. If you're enjoying the video, please subscribe the channel for future videos, and like and share with your friends. I am a fisherman by trade, born and raised in a small coastal village in Panama. The sea is my life, but also my greatest fear. Not for its giant waves or for its known creatures, but for the unknown that dwells in its unfathomable darkness. What I am going to tell happened years ago, but every time I close my eyes, I relive it as if it had happened yesterday. And even though I don't usually talk about this, something tells me that someone else must know. Maybe it's my way of exorcising the horror that has never left me. It was a quiet night on the high seas, one of those that begin like any other. There were 3 of us on the boat. Jorge, an old sea dog with more stories than teeth. Cesar, a young apprentice, and me. We had gone out at sunset as usual, looking to fill our nets with fish. The sky was clear, and the stars shone like guides. But the calm soon became disturbing. The fog suddenly arrived, thick and heavy, covering everything around us. It was so dense that we could barely see our own hands in front of us. The air was strangely charged with an unnatural silence. Even the waves seemed to have stopped. It was Cesar who noticed it first. A faint glow, like 2 small flames dancing in the distance. We stood still, trying to figure out what it was. But before we could speak, more lights appeared. Eyes that shone in the fog. There were too many to count, moving slowly, surrounding us. They weren't lanterns or reflections. They were eyes, and they were all fixed on us. Jorge tried to scare away our fear with a joke about bioluminescent fish, but his voice trembled. We knew that this was not normal. I felt a shiver run down my spine as the lights seemed to get closer, little by little. Cesar prayed in a low voice, and I clenched the oar in my hand, as if I could use it to defend myself from something I didn't understand. Nobody said anything, but we all felt it. We weren't alone. Suddenly, we heard a noise. It was a hollow thud, as if something had crashed into the boat. Then another and another. The eyes moved faster, surrounding us in circles. The fog seemed to get thicker with each minute. I felt the air getting colder until my breath formed small clouds in front of me. No one dared turn on the flashlight. We didn't want to reveal too much. It would only make things worse. That was when we heard it. A deep, growling, guttural sound like a growl, but it seemed to come from all directions at the same time. Jorge stood up abruptly, but something made him stop. His gaze was fixed on the water, just at the edge of the boat. Before he could warn us, something shot out from the depths. We didn't see it, but we felt the impact. The boat shook violently, as if something huge had crashed into us. Fear paralyzed us. We tried to row, but there was no way to orient ourselves. The compass spun senselessly, and the boat's engine didn't respond. We were trapped, floating in an ocean of mist and bright eyes. Every minute that passed, we felt something getting closer. Jorge whispered that we should stay calm, but his hands were shaking to the point that he could barely hold the oar. Cesar was white as a sheet, and I just wanted it to end. The next blow was stronger. The boat tilted dangerously, and for a moment, I thought it would overturn. Something cold and slippery brushed against my leg. I jumped away, with my heart pounding in my ears. It was at that moment when we saw the marks. Deep lines of claws, as if something had scratched the wood of the boat. Jorge touched them with the tips of his fingers, and for the first time in my life, I saw terror in his eyes. Suddenly, the growl returned, but this time, it was closer. It was a sound so deep that it vibrated in our bones. Then something came out of the water. We did not see it completely because the fog covered it, but it was bigger than the boat. Its eyes shone with an unnatural glow, and its shape was impossible to define. It was not a fish or a shark or anything that could have a name. Its presence was overwhelming, as if the sea itself had been incarnated in a monstrous creature. The last thing I remember from that night is the water covering everything. The boat rocked violently while the creature moved around us. After that, everything went black. When I woke up, the sun was already high. The fog had dissipated, but the boat was covered in claw marks. Jorge and Cesar were at my side, pale and silent. None of the three wanted to talk about what happened. No one would do it. We returned to the port with empty nets and a broken soul. Since then, I have not returned to the high seas. Some say that the fog can be treacherous, that it plays with your mind. But I know what I saw, what we felt, and I know that somewhere in the ocean, those eyes continue watching. I leave my name anonymous because there are things that are better not to associate with your identity, especially when it comes to something that you cannot explain and that could mark you as crazy. I live in Campeche, Mexico, and since I can remember, the sea has been my life. I caught fish before I knew how to tie shoelaces, and my father always told me that the sea was a living being, that it gave us food but also had its secrets. I never fully believed in those stories until that night. Now I believe it. Now, I know that the sea keeps things that should not come to the surface. It was a night without light, the kind of darkness that envelopes you and makes you lose track of time. I went out to fish alone, something that I rarely did, but there was a need for money, and the good fish did not wait for anyone. I had my little boat and a net that had served me well for years. There was no wind, and I heard nothing but the slapping of the water against the hull. It was the kind of silence that starts to get under your skin. Something was wrong, though I didn't know what. I rowed to an area that few fishermen frequented. My father called it the mouth, a corner where the sea seemed to open up into a black abyss. He said the big fish were there, but the place had a look as if it were watching you. That night, I needed a good catch, so I ignored his warning and cast the net. While I waited, I thought I heard something. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the air was still. It was like a moan, a low, dragging, almost human sound. I stood frozen, staring into the blackness, searching without really wanting to find anything. Suddenly, I saw something in the distance. It was a cliff, barely visible in the gloom. And there, standing, was a woman. She was motionless, in a white dress that shimmered slightly under the stars. There shouldn't be anyone there. It was a remote place, inaccessible from the mainland. My first thought was that she was lost or planning to jump. I yelled to warn her to get away from the edge, but she didn't move. When I yelled, I brought the boat a little closer. Her head turned toward me, and it was then that I saw it. Her eyes had no pupils or iris. They were two black holes, darker than the night itself. I felt like fear paralyzed me, but I couldn't look away. She raised an arm, pointing at me, and then, without warning, she let herself fall into the void. My reaction was instinctive. I rowed with all my strength toward the cliff, screaming, trying to see where she had fallen. But when I got there was no one. The water was calm, as if nothing had happened. My hands were shaking as I pulled the net to stretch it out. But when I tried to lift it, I realized that something was wrong. The net was too heavy, as if I had caught something huge. I fought with all my strength to pull it up, but in the end, the rope broke, and the net sank into the abyss. I cursed out loud, but something stopped me from continuing. In the water, right next to the boat, there was a figure floating motionless, face down. I turned on my flashlight and pointed it, hoping it was a corpse. Something that, although horrible, had a logical explanation. But it was not a body. The figure turned slowly until it was face up, and what I saw took my breath away. It was the woman from the cliff. Her face was pale, almost transparent, and her eyes were still those black pools. Her mouth suddenly opened in a silent scream, and the water around her began to bubble. That was when I felt the first blow against the hull of the boat. Something was beneath me, something big. The boat was rocking violently, as if a giant creature was pushing it. I tried to start the engine, but it didn't respond. Stronger blows shook the boat, and I heard the water begin to filter through the boards. It was at that moment when I understood that the sea was not a place but a presence. The bubbles around me increased, and suddenly, something emerged. It was a kind of huge, scaly hand with long fingers and membranes between them. I saw it just a few seconds before it sank again, but it was enough to paralyze me. I couldn't think. I couldn't move. All I knew was that I needed to get out of there. With one last effort, I rowed away from the bubbles and the blows. The water suddenly calmed down, as if the creature had lost interest. But then, I felt a pressure on my chest, a presence I couldn't explain. I looked over at the cliff, and there she was, standing again, watching me with those impossible eyes. I don't remember how I got back to shore. The next thing I knew, I was on my knees in the sand, soaked and shivering. My boat was a wreck, with deep scratch marks in the planks. I tried to tell someone what happened, but no one believed me. They said I had imagined things, that maybe I had fallen asleep. But I know what I saw, and I know I wasn't the first. Since then, I've talked to other fishermen who have felt that look in the water or who have seen things they can't explain. Some have even disappeared without a trace. I no longer fish in the mouth. In fact, I hardly go near the sea. But every time I hear the wind whistle or the pounding of the water, I feel like something is calling me. Something that should never have been disturbed. My name is Jose. I have been fishing in the Pacific all my life, like my father and his father before me. The ocean is my home, a place I have always respected but never feared, until that night changed everything. I had never felt such a deep fear, so visceral. It was a quiet night, the kind of calm that should relax any fisherman. But for me, it made me nervous. The sky was clear, the full moon reflected in the water like a mirror, and not a single wave disturbed the surface. Something felt strange, although I couldn't tell what it was. My small but sturdy boat glided through the water as if it were floating in oil. Everything was too still. As I checked my nets, I heard something that made me stop dead in my tracks. A whistle. A long, high-pitched sound, like someone trying to get my attention. My first thought was that some nearby fisherman was playing a joke, but when I looked around, I didn't see a single light on the horizon. It was impossible for someone to be so far away. However, the whistle came back, this time clearer, as if it came from the air itself, not the water. I tried to ignore it and concentrate on my work. I checked the nets and dropped them into the water, thinking that it was best to keep myself busy and not get carried away by silly ideas. But then, I felt something strange about the boat, as if an invisible weight had settled on it. There was no wind, no waves, but my boat creaked as if someone was walking on the hull. I stood still, listening, with my heart beating in my ears. But there were no footsteps, just the same whistling, closer this time, as if it was right behind me. I don't know why, but something told me not to look. I clung to the helm with sweaty hands and murmured to myself. But when I gathered the courage to turn around, there was no one. Only the endless ocean and the moon, shining with an almost painful intensity. At dawn, I found something that froze my blood. My nets were full of fish, but they were all dead. It was as if something had sucked the life out of them. Their eyes were black, empty, and their bodies were rigid and swollen. But that was not the worst. At the bottom of my boat, covered with a thin layer of salt water, there was something else, a drawing. I don't know how to explain it, but it looked like a humanoid figure made with a black and sticky substance, like tar. It had long, thin arms and an oval head without a face, only a dark hole in the center that looked like a single eye. My hands shook as I tried to clean it, but the mark wouldn't go away. It was like it was impregnated in the wood. I wanted to return to the port immediately, but a part of me was convinced that no one would believe me. How do you explain something like that without sounding like a crazy person? So, against my instinct, I decided to keep fishing, at least until I filled the nets with something I could sell. I needed to justify my absence. But the day was no better. The fish I caught kept appearing dead, and every time I checked the nets, I felt that same sensation of being watched, as if the ocean itself had eyes and was watching each of my movements. When night fell, I prepared to return. But then, something happened that I will never forget. The bright and omnipresent moon began to dim. It was not like when clouds pass in front of it. This was different. It was as if someone had covered the moon with a shadow. The water, which was once so calm, began to stir. At first, they were small waves, but in a matter of minutes, they became waves that shook my boat violently. And then, I heard it again, the whistle. This time, it wasn't a distant sound. It was loud, deafening, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once. It covered my ears, but it was no use. The whistle was inside my head. I fell to my knees in the boat, trying not to vomit from dizziness. It was then that I saw something emerge from the water, a few meters from me. At first, I thought it was a rock or some floating object, but when my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized what it was. It was a figure just like the one drawn on the bottom of my boat. Tall, thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its skin was dark, shiny, as if it were made of oil. It had no face, but from its head emerged a single hole that emitted the whistle. I don't know how, but I knew it was looking at me. It had no eyes, but I felt its attention fixed on me, as if it were studying me. I tried to start the engine, but my hands didn't respond. Fear had me paralyzed. I could only watch as that thing approached, slowly sliding over the water, as if it didn't need to swim. When it was a few meters away, it stopped. Then it raised a long, thin arm. The whistling stopped, and instead, I heard something that made my blood run cold. My own name, Jose. It was a low, guttural voice, as if it came from the depths of the ocean. I don't know how I had the courage, but I finally managed to start the engine. I accelerated as fast as I could, without looking back, with my heart beating in my chest like a drum. I could hear the water churning behind me, as if something huge was chasing me, but I didn't dare to look. I kept going, praying to get to land. When I finally saw the lights of the port, I felt a mix of relief and terror. I didn't slow down until my boat hit the dock, and when it did, I jumped immediately. My father and some fishermen who were there ran toward me, asking what had happened, but I couldn't speak. I just pointed at the boat. When they checked the inside, they didn't find anything. Not the drawn figure, nor the dead fish. Only the salt water, as if nothing had happened. Since then, I have not gone out to sea again. I sold my boat and moved inland, as far away from the ocean as possible. But the nights are still a torment. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can hear that whistle, always distant, always calling me. And I know that sooner or later I will have to answer, because there are things in the ocean that we cannot understand, things that do not belong to this world. And even if we run away, they always find a way to reach us. A few years ago, I made my living as a fisherman on the coasts of Honduras. It was not an easy job, but it was my life, my pride. Every day, I went out to sea before the sun came up and did not return until nightfall, with the hope of filling my nets and bringing something to eat home. That day, the sky was overcast, and the sea, although calm, had a heavy air, as if it hid a secret under its surface. If I had known what was about to happen, I would have burned my boat and left the trade forever. I had sailed a few miles out to sea, right where fishermen said that the water darkens like ink. There, In the infinite solitude of the ocean, I threw my nets. I stayed waiting, humming an old song that my grandfather used to sing while he fished with me as a child. Suddenly, the nets began to sink with a force that I had never seen before. It must be something big, I thought, although a strange sensation sank into my bones. When I picked up the net, I came across something I had never seen. It was a dolphin, but not like the ones I used to find. This one was completely black, as if it were made of shadows. Its eyes were huge and empty, a black even deeper than its skin, almost impossible to describe. It didn't seem alive, but not dead either. A shiver ran down my spine as I looked at it, but ambition won me over. I thought I could sell it for a good price or at least use it as a rare amulet. That night, as soon as I returned home, the atmosphere became heavy. My wife and my 2 children seemed restless, as if they felt something they couldn't explain. The air inside the house was dense, with a salty and metallic smell that didn't go away, no matter how much I opened the windows. I left the dolphin in a corner of the backyard and decided to worry about it the next day. Meanwhile, I couldn't get the feeling out of my head that something was watching me. Even inside my own house, the first sign that something was wrong came at dawn. My youngest son woke up crying for no apparent reason. He said he had had a nightmare, but he couldn't remember what it was about. My wife began to complain of a pain in her chest that she couldn't explain. And although I didn't say it, I felt a constant pressure in my stomach, as if something heavy was squeezing me from the inside. I decided to go out to sea early to distract myself, but when I got to the boat, I found that the nets were broken, and the wood of the hull seemed corroded, as if it had been underwater for months. Even though I had repaired it only weeks ago, something inside me told me it was the dolphin's fault, but I didn't want to believe it. It was just an animal, right? However, the days that followed were even worse. My family fell ill with inexplicable fever and chills. No doctor could find the cause, and no matter how hard I tried to catch fish, the fish seemed to avoid my nets, as if they were cursed. The house began to creak at night, with sounds that seemed like footsteps dragging themselves along the roof. More than once, I woke up startled, sure I had heard a whisper or a knock on the wall next to my bed. The dolphin was still there in the yard. Its skin, instead of decomposing, seemed to darken even more, as if it absorbed the light from the sun. One afternoon, while trying to bury it, I noticed that its eyes, which I would swear were empty, now had something in them, a kind of faint glow, like the reflection of a distant fire. I dropped the shovel and stepped back, with my heart beating wildly. It was then that I decided to seek help. A friend told me about a shaman who lived in a neighboring town, someone who understood things of the sea. At first, I hesitated, but desperation led me to look for him. When I told him my story, his face tensed. He told me that what I had caught was not a common dolphin, but a spirit, a guardian of the ocean, one that protected the waters and those who respected them. By having taken it out of the sea, I had unleashed its wrath. The shaman explained to me that I had to return it to the sea, but it would not be so easy. I had to do it at nightfall during the new moon and offer some of my blood as an apology. He gave me a ceremonial knife and some instructions that sounded more like a rite than a solution. I had nothing to lose, so I decided to try. The night of the new moon came with a cold wind that chilled me to the bone. I loaded the dolphin in my boat and rowed down to the dark waters where I had found it. Everything was eerily silent. Not a wave, nor a sound of seagulls. Only my breathing and the creaking of the wood under my feet. Following the shaman's instructions, I cut my palm with the knife and let my blood fall on the dolphin. At that instant, the water began to move violently, as if something huge was beneath me. The dolphin seemed to sink into the wood of the boat, and its empty eyes turned toward me for the last time. Suddenly, a heart-rending scream echoed in the night. It was not human, but it did not seem like an animal either. It was as if the sea itself was screaming. Then, the water calmed down, and everything was silent. When I returned home, the atmosphere had changed. My family began to recover, and things slowly returned to normal. But I was never the same. Every time I go out to sea, I feel like something is watching me from the depths. And at night, when the wind blows hard, I swear I hear that scream, reminding me of what I did and how close I was to losing everything. Now, every time someone asks me why I don't fish in the deep waters, I just say that they are dangerous. I don't want to talk about the curse of the black dolphin. But if you ever come across something in the sea that you do not understand, I beg you to let it go. Because the ocean holds secrets that are better not to unearth.